What's up guys, Rotozap here, and today we're going to be talking about the top 5 utility spells for max level PvP in Wiz. I'm going to be going over the spells that are universal, I guess you could say, because there are examples of really good utility spells, but they're really specific to a particular school. For example, Ice has Ice Bird. It's a 2-pip spell that does damage, and then gives the user a blade. But that's really specific to Ice. No one else is going to be using that, so we're really going to be covering spells that can be used by everyone and can kind of just be thrown in as a one of or two of in your side deck for any school. So with that all being said, let's get into number 5 here, which is going to be Storm Beetle. So Storm Beetle is a really old card. It's a classic for sure. It definitely used to be a staple in a lot of people's decks, but it's kind of fallen off in popularity, which is why it landed itself at number 5. But Storm Beetle is a 1-pip spell, which is really relevant because that means that everyone can use this no problem. That does 125 storm damage and gives the user a 25% balance blade. And yes, this is a balanced blade, so that means that any school can use it. But that also means that literally the next spell you use, if it's a hitting spell, it will use the blade. So you just gotta be careful with it. But this is really strong because a common theme you're going to be seeing with these utility spells is that they take off weaknesses or shields, and then they provide an additional benefit to the user, like giving them a blade or giving the target a weakness, something along those lines. And that's really what at its core a utility spell is. It's accomplishing multiple things on the same turn, right? And for this particular example, we're breaking a shield, we're taking off a weakness, as well as blading for the turn. So it's really powerful. The ways to get this, it does come in TC form, but the TC of it is pretty rare. Your best bet, if you really want to include this into your deck, just make a Storm Beetle pet. Storm Beetle pets are pretty rare, though. Back in the day, at least, they were only given out really as a giveaway type pet, like on Twitter giveaways and stuff. And that's what this actually is. It's a very old pet that came from a Twitter giveaway. It's still first generation, and yeah. So it's a pretty rare pet to get your hands on, but if you have it, there you go, you can use it. But yeah, Storm Beetle, it's a pretty good spell. The only issue with it is that it does have 70% accuracy, and you're very likely not going to have 30% accuracy to Storm unless you are a Storm Wizard. So just keep that in mind when thinking about including this. But let's get into number 4. Alright, so number 4 is going to be another spell that kind of falls into the category of it's a classic, it's very old. People used it a lot back in the day, but not so much as of recently. And that is, of course, Empower. So Empower says for 1 pip, again, really nice because everyone can use it, the target takes 250 death damage and you gain 3 pips by doing this. You also cannot crit yourself. So Empower is ironically good for everyone except Death Wizards, because I really can't recommend, unless you're a Jade Death, that you use this, because people have so much damage in Pierce these days that, in my opinion, it's not really worth it to Empower, hit yourself for like 500 damage, and then get 3 pips off it. It's not quite worth it. Now, it could be worth it, though, if you have something like an Ifrit weakness on you, or anything along those lines, right? And that's why Empower is a really nice utility spell, because you're getting a lot of pips off it, but at the same time, you're able to take off things like really potent traps, like a feint, and you're also able to take off self weaknesses. So it's really strong. It's a good utility spell. But like I said, the best use for this is probably if your opponent has a really large weakness on you, like let's say an Ifrit weakness. You can take off that Ifrit weakness, you're going to take very minimal damage to yourself, and you're going to get 3 pips in the process. And if you're a school that is not death, you don't have to waste any of the blades that are currently on your person. You can just Empower, call it a day. But yeah, like I said, this is kind of low though on the list because you really just don't see this that often anymore in PvP. For whatever reason, it's kind of just fallen out of meta, but it's still a very good card, definitely a candidate to make its way into your side deck. So definitely give it a consideration when you're building your side. But let's get into number 3. Alright, number 3, I'm going to do Shift Greenock as my pick here, because Shift Greenock is a really good spell, and I think it's highly underrated. All the Shift spells are very interesting, and I think that they should all be looked at, but Shift Greenock, I think, if I had to pick one of the group, is probably the best. So for 3 pips, it is a moon spell that does 340 life damage and applies a minus 25 weakness to the opponent and a plus 25 blade to yourself. So it's very similar actually to the Storm Beetle that we already looked at for number 5, except this is kind of a little more intense because it's 3 pips, it does significantly more damage, and on top of applying a blade to yourself, it puts a weakness on your opponent. So it just has a little bit more utility. It's definitely a good spell, but this is kind of another one of those where, like, even though, yeah, every school can use it, really you don't see more than a couple schools using it, right? I mean, I'd recommend this for a Death Wizard, a Myth Wizard, probably. I mean, if you're Ice, I suppose you could do this. If you're Ice, though, I mean, Ice Bird just seems like a better option to me. But, you know, I guess you could always run Shift Greenock. It's possible. But yeah, I don't know. It's only good for, I think, a select couple schools here, but it is definitely really good, though. Like, if you are those schools, definitely pack it. And I don't think it's really exclusive enough to really warrant not putting it on the list. So, because that's how all the shift spells are. All the shift spells are pretty decent, but they are somewhat exclusive in who actually realistically is going to use them. Theoretically, every school could use them, but a good player probably isn't going to use this on, per se, I don't know, like a Fire Wizard. Like, why would a Fire Wizard ever waste 3 pips doing this? It just doesn't make sense. So, like I said, it's kind of exclusive, but not really. Technically, everyone can use it, but realistically, you're only going to see a few schools using it. But if you are Death or like Myth or something, highly recommend you put it in your deck because it's really strong. So, without further ado, let's get into number 3. Alright, so number 2 is going to be Myth Banshee. So, I actually don't think a lot of people are really aware of this card. It's really strong. It's a 3-pip Myth spell that does 190 damage, but it stuns at the end of that. So, like I said, following the general trend of these utility spells, they're mostly consisting of shield breakers or weakness, for lack of better words, a weakness getter offer, right? It just takes off weaknesses, as well as providing the utility of stunning your opponent, which is actually really big. I find this spell most useful for when you're going second and you really want to use a big hit, but you're very nervous about them putting on a shield or dispelling you or something like that. So this is a really good way to make sure that you are going to have an open shot for your attack. And that's why it's so powerful. Now, not every school can really utilize this, for sure. I think that Balance doesn't really get any use out of this. I think that Ice is iffy. I mean, Myth could be good, but the only problem is you're running the risk of getting rid of blades you might already have on. Really, this spell is great for like Death and Life. That is the characters that I most see this working on, and that's really what I do on my Life. This is a really great spell that I use on my Life quite frequently, actually, because if I have a couple blades on and I want to hit them really hard with a cat or something, I don't want to do that if I'm going second without them being stunned or something. And you might argue, well, why don't you just use a single stun, like a single 0-pip stun? Well, my counter to that is Myth Banshee is really nice because it breaks shields, right? So your opponent's guard may be up or down, depending on what you want to define that as, because they may already have a tower shield on them, so they may think they're safe. There's nothing that's going to happen. They're kind of like less on edge, right? So they think they're safe, but what they don't realize is you can really easily combo a Myth Banshee into a cat or really anything and do substantial damage to them and guarantee yourself an open shot. So that's the reason I like it over a single stun, especially for those schools. Now, of course, if you are Balance or Ice or any of the ones that don't really mix well with Myth Banshee, obviously a single stun for 0 pips is going to be a little bit better, but this is really good. Definitely do not sleep on Myth Banshee, especially if you're Life or Death. And also, if you're playing against a Life or Death, don't forget to stun block, because a lot of them do play Myth Banshee. It is a very viable option for them. So just don't forget that that is in the realm of possibility. But if you don't already play this in your deck, I highly recommend you put it in. It is going to change the outcome of a lot of your matches, because if you're going second, it's going to guarantee that you can get a really big hit off without having to run the risk of them shielding into it or dispelling you into it or any of that other nonsense. But without further ado, let us get into the number one best utility spell that everyone can make use of for max level PvP. Alright, the moment you've all been waiting for. The number one best utility spell for max level PvP is a tie. Yeah, I hate to be that guy, but these two spells are very similar in nature, and I feel like you really can't put one on the list without putting the other. So I am, of course, talking about Shift and Triage. So Shift and Triage are quite similar, actually. If we take a look at them, they both concern overtimes, and they both remove an overtime. Now, this is where the similarities stop, because outside of that, they're quite different spells, actually. So Triage is a life spell that is 0 pips, and it removes an overtime from a target. So it doesn't have to be on yourself. You can remove it from someone else. So for example, if you're in a 2v2 or something, you have Triage, your teammate has an overtime that you want to take off, you can Triage them and get it off of them. Shift, on the other hand, is only on yourself, so you can only do this with an overtime that you have on yourself. Now, of course, most people are just playing 1v1s, so like the whole target thing isn't typically relevant, but it is just something to note. Now, Shift, though, instead of just removing the overtime, as the name implies, it shifts the overtime to the opponent. So, for example, if your opponent uses FFA or something, or no, not FFA. What? I wish it worked like that with FFA. No, if they used Rampage, then you could shift the Rampage back onto them, and they would take the full damage of Rampage, which is really overpowered, right? So Shift and Triage have a couple different situational uses, but really at the end of the day, they're both very similar spells. So I felt like I had to put them on for tied for the number one spot, right? So when would you use Triage over Shift, and when would you use Shift over Triage? Well, I find that when you're facing fire wizards, like as a whole, Shift is typically better, because they don't really use a lot of like smaller overtimes. I mean, they do, but they're so small that it's not even worth using a Triage, because typically what distinguishes using a Shift from a Triage is like how powerful it's going to be, or what the opponent is trying to accomplish by putting the overtime on you. For example, if you're facing an ice or fire wizard, they're very likely using an overtime so that they can hit you with something really big after, right? So using ice as an example, typically ice wizards will frostbite so that you can't shield, and then that's when they use Weaver. So that's when a situation where you would probably Triage, actually, because a frostbite, unless it's like really bladed up, is not going to be that strong. But fire, on the other hand, when they use Rampage because they're trying to do like a Rampage into FFA combo, that's when Shift is really strong, because you shift over the Rampage so that it doesn't do any damage to you. Yes, they do have an open FFA, but it's not an open FFA plus the Rampage, because the Rampage plus the 35% trap is probably going to do more damage than the extra damage that the FFA is doing on you, because it's an open shot as opposed to a shielded shot. So, and you never know, they might not even use FFA, they might just use Fire Beetle. And if they use Fire Beetle, you really come out on top, because that just means you shifted Rampage over to them, they take Rampage damage, and then they just randomly use Fire Beetle on you. So Shift definitely has its purpose, and so does Triage. You kind of just have to make the decision yourself on which one is more appropriate and kind of who you think you're going to be facing more. Now, if you're a Myth Wizard, Shift is a even better spell, because you can use it for a power pip and a single pip, but for all the other schools it costs 3, so just keep that in mind. And that's also why I don't really recommend you shift something unless it's going to be a really powerful hit, because you got to keep in mind you're wasting 3 pips to shift it when you could just be triaging it for 0. So, always keep that in mind when you're deliberating whether or not you should be using a shift or triage. General rule of thumb, shift for bigger hits, triage for smaller hits. But don't triage dumb things. Like if they use a fire elf on you or something, it's really not worth it to triage that, because it's like it's almost a wasted turn, in my opinion at least. Now, of course, there could be a situation where that's completely not true, but this is just kind of a general rule of thumb for you guys to follow. But yeah, with that all being said, I hope you guys enjoyed my list today, and I highly recommend you put some of these cards in your deck if they're not already in there. And I should be coming to you guys with some PvP videos pretty soon. But of course, give me some suggestions in the comments. What schools do you want to see? What level ranges do you want to see? And I will try and get that content out to you guys. So with that all being said, if you guys like the video, make sure to leave a like, all that good stuff. And enjoy the rest of your day. Rotozap out.